No one deceived you by accident. If you never understood how money really works, it's not for lack of intelligence, it's for an excess of invisible architecture. Machiavelli would have smiled at that. He knew that true power lies not in dominating people, but in shaping the field where they think they choose. And you've spent your whole life walking inside a labyrinth built by hands you've never seen. You learned early on that money is work, effort, merit. But Machiavelli would teach something else. Power is not born from virtue, it is born from structure. The prince does not win because he is good. He wins because he controls the symbols that define what is good. Money is not valuable because it is real. It is valuable because everyone believes it is. This collective belief is the first prison, soft, invisible, comfortable. Ask yourself, if tomorrow everyone woke up and decided that the money in your wallet is just paper, what would be left of you? Your salary is not wealth. It is a social promise sustained by fear, habit, and silent obedience. The state does not guarantee this value. What guarantees it is the crowd, trained never to question the pact. Machiavelli would understand this as a game of perception. For him, whoever controls the narrative controls destiny. And for centuries, a small circle realized that if they could govern collective trust, they would govern the world without ever appearing. Thus was born the illusion that money is technical, complex, too distant to be unraveled by ordinary people. A smoke screen. A ritualistic veil. You deposit your salary and believe it rests in cold vaults. Machiavelli would say that's theater. Money doesn't sleep. It multiplies in the shadows, digitally created from future promises, from debts that don't even exist yet. With each loan, a new fragment of reality is manufactured. A value that only lives as long as someone works to pay for it. And here comes the cruelest psychological trait of this system: it doesn't need soldiers. It needs tired people. People too busy surviving to investigate the reason for their own imprisonment. Machiavelli described the people as volatile, but profoundly predictable when pressured by fear and need. Indebted, a man doesn't conspire. He obeys. Notice how you were trained to desire before you understood. House, car, objects that symbolize victory. But Machiavelli would warn symbols don't liberate. They only mask the real hierarchy. You don't buy things. You buy belonging. And you pay with decades of your autonomy. There's something almost ritualistic about it. A system that doesn't force, it seduces. It doesn't threaten, it invites. You're not chained. You're persuaded to enter the cell with a smile. The debt doesn't arrive as punishment, it arrives as a privilege. Early access to pleasure. Time stolen from the future to anesthetize the present. You wonder why you feel like you're never moving forward. You work harder, earn more, but remain trapped. Machiavelli would say that this isn't a moral failing, it's strategic design. The system wasn't made for you to win. It was made for you to remain functional. Strong enough to produce, weak enough never to break free. And the more you blame yourself, the deeper you get into the game. Because self-criticism is the greatest weapon of control. A man who believes he fails due to incompetence never realizes he was led astray. Shame replaces anger. Anxiety replaces clarity. Now think about this coldly. Why didn't anyone teach you this in school? Why do you know how to solve equations, but don't understand how money is made? Machiavelli would teach that knowledge is only distributed when it strengthens those who govern. The rest is kept in the mists of time, not out of malice, but out of efficiency. This is the point where everything begins to change. Not because you now have power, but because you have begun to see. Vision doesn't immediately liberate you, but it breaks the spell. You are not weak. You are embedded in a psychological machine that feeds on your unconsciousness. And this machine has only one requirement: that you never realize you're playing. Because the day you understand that money is not value, but language, that debt is not an accident, but an instrument, that collective trust is not natural, but cultivated, something inside you stops working the way it used to. Machiavelli would say that this is the most dangerous moment in a man's life, when he ceases to be a pawn and begins, even silently, to become a player. You wake up, check your balance on the bank app, and feel that brief relief at seeing still positive numbers. Machiavelli would see this daily gesture as a modern rite of submission. It's not the amount that brings peace, it's the permission to continue existing within the system. As long as the numbers are there, you are authorized to live. When they disappear, anxiety sets in as if something essential has been taken from you. It's not just money, it's identity. Imagine a common scene: you deposit your salary, close the app, and move on to the next job, the next obligation. It seems banal, but in that instant, something invisible happens. The money you believe is safe begins to circulate in layers you will never see. Machiavelli would understand this as the supreme art of power, moving entire structures without ever touching the individual. You feel in control, but control has already changed hands. Perhaps you've already experienced the modern-day nightmare: an unexpected automatic debit, an overdrawn credit limit, a fee you don't remember authorizing. You feel anger, but quickly transform it into shame. I should have been more careful. Machiavelli would smile again. Nothing strengthens a system more than the internal guilt of those who are exploited. When you blame yourself, you don't blame the machine. You start to notice that every month something seems to slip through the cracks. An installment payment here, an automatic renewal there. Services you no longer use, but continue to be charged. The feeling is always the same: I'm working, but I'm not making progress. It's like running on a treadmill that never turns off. Machiavelli would call this planned burnout, a permanent state of fatigue that prevents any strategic thinking. Think about the loans offered with smooth talk: fast money, easy credit, financial freedom. You receive notifications as if they were personal invitations. One touch on the screen and you have access to amounts that don't yet exist. It seems like power, but it's dependence disguised as choice. The system doesn't beg, it seduces. You might remember the first time you bought something important on installment. The joy of leaving the store with the item in your hands, even knowing it wasn't truly yours yet. For months, maybe years, that possession accompanied you as a silent reminder that a part of your future was already committed. Machiavelli would teach that the best kind of prison is the one you carry with pride. There's a subtle shift that almost no one notices. At first, the debt seems temporary. Then, it becomes normal. One day you wake up and realize you don't remember what it's like to owe nothing. The state of indebtedness ceases to be the exception and becomes the landscape. You start organizing your life around installments, due dates, renegotiations. The calendar no longer measures time, it measures obligations. And then comes the fear. Fear of losing one's job. Fear of getting sick. Fear of trying something new. Every decision is filtered through the silent question: does this jeopardize my ability to pay? Machiavelli would say that this is the moment when man stops acting and only reacts. Not out of cowardice, but out of conditioning. Observe the conversations around you. People talking about tiredness as if it were a virtue. About being overwhelmed as if it were destiny. About debt as if it were a natural part of adult life. No one questions why. They just share the pain, as if that creates some kind of comfort. The system strengthens itself every time suffering is normalized. But there's something even more disturbing. You realize that even when you earn more, freedom doesn't come. Your salary goes up, and so do your responsibilities. Your standard of living expands and stifles any chance of respite. Machiavelli would warn that true power lies not in preventing you from rising, but in ensuring that, as you rise, you take your prison with you. Perhaps you're listening to this and thinking you could simply say no. Refuse credit, simplify your life, get out of the game. But the game has already shaped your desires. It doesn't just hold you captive on the outside. It is settled inside your mind, in your criteria for success, in your silent comparisons with the lives of others. And here the first crack in the illusion appears. A moment of profound, almost physical discomfort upon realizing that your routine wasn't built by you. It was suggested, repeated, reinforced until it became inevitable. Machiavelli knew that when a man realizes his choices have been guided, he enters dangerous territory. Because consciousness, once awakened, never returns to its previous state. You still don't know how to get out. Maybe you don't even believe there is a way out. But something has changed. The feeling that there's a hidden mechanism is starting to become clearer. And this perception, although uncomfortable, is the first movement out of the collective hypnosis. You start to notice that it's not just the money that disappears, but the energy it takes with it. It's not just the balance that dwindles, it's the willingness to imagine different futures. Machiavelli would understand this depletion as a calculated side effect. The more tired you are, the less you question. The system doesn't need to watch you all the time, it drains you until you do the work for it. Notice how your financial thoughts are almost never strategic. They are emergencies. Paying the next bill, covering the month's deficit, surviving until the next deposit. Machiavelli would say that those who live in a state of urgency govern nothing, they only put out fires. And a man who is constantly putting out fires doesn't build exits, only narrower corridors within the same prison. Have you ever wondered why the feeling of always being behind schedule never goes away, even when you try harder than ever? Perhaps you've experienced a moment when something unexpected happens. Your car breaks down, a relative needs help, your company cuts benefits. Suddenly, your entire credit card castle collapses. There were no reserves, no margin. Machiavelli would see this as proof that the system was designed to keep you always one step away from collapse. Not to destroy you, but to keep you malleable. With each new crisis, you adapt. You adjust your budget, cut back on pleasures, promise yourself that next year everything will be different. The curious thing is that next year always seems the same as the last. There's an invisible loop that repeats itself, as if time had been folded back on itself. Machiavelli would say that repetition is the most efficient form of psychological domination. When the future looks too much like the past, hope becomes abstract. When was the last time you felt like you were actually building something, and not just keeping things afloat for another month? You begin to realize that debt isn't just a financial contract, it's an emotional one. It invades your conversations, your dreams, your intimate decisions. You measure relationships, moving to a new city, even family plans by the impact they'll have on your finances. Money ceases to be a tool and becomes a filter of reality. Machiavelli understood that the most effective control is not external, but internal. The ideal governed is one that self-corrects, that censors itself before being censored. And debt does exactly that. It teaches you to think small, to avoid risks, to always choose what seems safest, even if it distances you from any form of real expansion. Have you noticed how your choices seem less and less daring, more aligned with what keeps everything exactly as it is? There's a rarely discussed detail. The more indebted you are, the more predictable your behavior becomes. The financial system operates with models, statistics, probabilities. It doesn't need to know who you are, it only needs to know how you react under pressure. Machiavelli would see this as a modern form of social engineering, entire masses driven not by force, but by patterns of exhaustion. Perhaps you remember the first time you tried to change something big in your life. Starting a business, changing careers, studying something new. And perhaps you also remember how quickly that idea was stifled by spreadsheets, bills, and commitments. Ambition dies not for lack of talent, but for lack of breath. And breath is drained daily, drop by drop. Who would you be today if you hadn't spent years just trying to stay on your feet? There's something cruelly ironic about all of this. You live in an era with more access to information than any previous generation, but you have less mental time to reflect on your own life. Machiavelli would say that an abundance of stimuli is the new form of censorship. When everything grabs your attention, nothing is truly thought about. You scroll through your phone at night, too tired for anything profound. News, videos, distractions. A gentle numbness that replaces introspection. The system doesn't need to forbid you from thinking. It just needs to keep you busy enough so that you never reach a dangerous conclusion. Can you remember the last time you were in absolute silence, without screens, without noise, just observing your own thoughts? The turning point begins like this, almost imperceptibly. A discomfort that doesn't dissipate with shopping or entertainment. A feeling that you're not just tired, but out of sorts. Machiavelli would call this a symbolic rupture, when a person begins to feel that something in their life is not just difficult, but wrong. This realization is unsettling. It pulls the rug out from under you. Because if the problem isn't just effort, nor just bad luck, then perhaps it's structural. And structures aren't solved with more willpower. They require a cold, hard analysis of the situation, strategy, and patience. Are you ready to abandon the idea that simply working harder is enough to set yourself free? Deep down, you already know that it's not about producing more, but about understanding better. About exchanging impulse for observation, haste for calculation. Machiavelli never admired those who rushed. He respected those who waited for the exact moment to act. And perhaps, for the first time, you are beginning to realize that your greatest enemy is not the lack of money, but the way you were taught to navigate within it. You begin to realize that prison has no walls. It manifests itself in small daily choices, so common that they go unnoticed. Machiavelli would say that the most sophisticated form of control is the one that blends into routine until it becomes invisible. No one forces you to buy, to pay in installments, to accept terms you haven't read. You do all this voluntarily, convinced that this is how adult life works. There's a little-known statistic that reveals much more than just numbers. In several developed countries, more than half the population cannot afford an unexpected expense without resorting to credit. No matter how hard they work, they always live one emergency away from collapse. This is no accident. It's designed. A healthy system doesn't leave the majority without a safety net. Machiavelli would see this as the construction of an eternally manageable mass. Perhaps you've seen stories of people who win the lottery and, a few years later, are back in debt. It sounds crazy, but it's predictable. When the mind doesn't change, money only amplifies old patterns. Machiavelli would teach that gold doesn't transform a man, it only reveals his inner structure. Without a strategic understanding of one's own behavior, even a fortune can dissolve. Notice how the system's language is always welcoming. Buy now, pay later. You deserve it. Invest in yourself. The words are gentle, but the effect is harsh. Immediate pleasure creates a chemical cycle in the brain that is mistaken for victory. Only later comes the silent weight of the installments, transforming that moment of euphoria into a long-term contract with anxiety. There are almost unbelievable cases. People who pay for an apartment for decades and, in the end, have already spent more than double the original value. People who continue to owe money even after years of regular payments, as if the debt had a life of its own. Machiavelli would say that time is the most efficient weapon of power. It doesn't need to defeat you today, it just needs to keep you committed tomorrow. You then realize that it's not just the money that's at stake, but the narrative you construct about yourself. I'm not there yet. After I pay this off, everything changes. These phrases become mantras, always projecting freedom into a future that never materializes. Hope, when misdirected, becomes just another cog in the machine of control. Data shows that consumption increases precisely during periods of greater social stress. Crises, political instability, collective fear. Instead of retreating, people buy more. It's as if they're trying to anesthetize the uncertainty with objects. Machiavelli would understand this behavior as a symbolic escape when the world seems uncontrollable. The individual seeks small islands of immediate pleasure to preserve sanity. And then there's the cruel paradox: the more you depend on the system to feel safe, the less safe you actually are. Each new subscription, each loan, each additional card expands the invisible network that surrounds you. You don't feel the tightening grip the moment you sign. It only reveals itself when something unexpected happens. A minor unforeseen event turns into an avalanche. There are stories of people who worked for 30 years at a company and, upon being laid off, discovered they didn't even have 3 months of financial leeway. Machiavelli would say that true poverty is not the lack of money, but the absence of a margin. Without a margin, there is no strategy, only reaction. You begin to see that the system doesn't just want you to pay. It wants you to keep believing you're close to victory. The constant promise that it's almost over keeps you moving, even when there's no finish line. It's like a mirage in the desert. You keep walking because you believe the water is right there, even when your thirst only grows stronger. In certain ancient cultures, debt was considered a form of servitude, and not without reason. A man who is in debt does not fully belong to himself. His time already has an owner, even if he has never shaken that owner's hand. Machiavelli understood this logic well. For him, dependence was always the true currency of power. The more you observe, the more you realize that the system's complexity isn't there to protect you, but to tire you out. Lengthy contracts, technical terms, acronyms, hidden fees. Intellectual fatigue leads you to trust, not because you believe, but because you've given up trying to understand. And those who give up trying to understand gradually surrender their own autonomy. At this point in the journey, something changes within you. It's not rebellion yet. It's uncomfortable lucidity. A feeling that the game is not only unfair, but intentionally opaque. Machiavelli would say that seeing this as crossing a symbolic boundary, you cease to be merely a participant and begin, even if timidly, to become an observer. You begin to realize that there are people who walk through the same system as you, but seem not to suffer the same effects. They are not immune to crises, but they weather storms with an almost irritating calm. Machiavelli would say that this is not luck, it's field reading. They don't move on impulse, but by position. These people use the same tool that traps you, debt, but in a different way. While you go into debt to consume, they go into debt to build. You exchange money for objects that lose value. They exchange debt for assets that generate income. The difference seems subtle, but the effect is brutal. Instead of draining the future, they nurture it. There are reports of investors who bought properties with little of their own capital, rented them out, refinanced them, and bought them again. Not because they are geniuses, but because they understood leverage. Machiavelli would see this as the intelligent use of the enemy's strength against him. The system that demands debt becomes the ladder for those who know where to step. Meanwhile, you might remember how many times you've heard that investing is risky, that it's only for those who are already rich. This narrative isn't innocent. It keeps most people away from the only mechanism that truly creates margin. You've been trained to fear movement and to feel safe in stagnation. The numbers don't lie. A modest investment, made early, grows almost absurdly over the decades. But most people only discover this too late, when they are already too tired to begin. Machiavelli would say that delay is the invisible weapon of power. It doesn't need to prevent you from acting, it just needs to make you act late. And then comes the most uncomfortable twist: the rich don't pay taxes the same way you do. They use legal loopholes, deductions, and legal structures that turn interest into a tax advantage. While you pay everything after the deductions, they shape the system so that the money works even before it reaches the hands of the state. It's not illegal. It's strategic. You feel the tension rising because you realize the game isn't just unequal, it's asymmetrical. You're not competing under the same rules, even though you pretend you are. Machiavelli taught that formal equality is a powerful mask. Everyone is free, everyone can try, but only a few know the hidden map. Perhaps you remember hearing that money works for them. Now you're beginning to understand what that means. Their money produces more money, while yours simply disappears in expenses. They don't chase income, they build income-generating machines. And each of these machines widens the gap even further. The cruelest part is that many of them no longer even realize their privilege. For them, it's normal. They started with inheritance, connections, and financial education from a young age. When they make a mistake, they fall on mattresses. When you make a mistake, you fall to the ground. Machiavelli would say that fortune favors those already in a high position, not because it's fair, but because the structure was designed to reinforce hierarchies. At this point, you might feel anger, a desire to break everything. But pure anger doesn't liberate, it only blinds. What Machiavelli proposed was something else: coldness. Observation. The ability to separate emotion from strategy. Because the system expects your indignation. It doesn't fear the outcry, it fears the calculation. You begin to see that if you continue using the same tools in the same way, the result doesn't change. Working longer hours in exchange for more consumption doesn't create a way out, it creates inertia. The tension grows because the conclusion approaches there is no liberation without repositioning. You feel you're on the verge of something decisive. Not because someone promised you wealth, but because, for the first time, you don't feel completely lost within the labyrinth. There are patterns, there are routes, there are traps. And if there are traps, there are also loopholes. Machiavelli would say that every system, however closed it may seem, always leaves gaps for those who learn to see without haste. You've arrived here not out of curiosity, but because something within you no longer accepts living on autopilot. Machiavelli would say this is the rarest moment in a man's life, the moment when he stops reacting and begins to choose. There are no trumpets, no lights. There is only a different kind of inner silence, as if the mind were, for the first time, looking into its own labyrinth. Perhaps you don't know exactly what to do yet, but now you see what you can no longer pretend doesn't exist. You realize that money is not just an external tool, but a language you learned incorrectly. That debt is not just a number, but a psychological contract that shapes your fears, your limits, and even how you imagine the future. And when the language changes, identity changes too. Machiavelli never offered comfort. He offered clarity. He knew that no system falls when attacked from the outside, but when understood from within. And understanding begins with small, almost invisible, practical gestures that alter the entire trajectory. The first of these is to recover the margin. I'm not talking about immediate wealth, but about mental and financial space. Cancel what no longer serves, cut what only anesthetizes, create a gap between desire and action. This gap is where strategy is born. The second step is to change how you use debt. Not as an escape, but as a tool. Not for consumption, but for building. Before any financial commitment, you start asking yourself not only if you can afford it, but if it creates more freedom in the future. Machiavelli would say that every decision should be judged not by immediate pleasure, but by the position it creates. The third step is to transform curiosity into study. Not abstract study, but observation of the real world. You start looking at people who are where you would like to be, not to blindly copy them, but to map patterns. How they earn, how they invest, how they protect themselves. The invisible game reveals itself little by little, not in theories, but in behaviors. Perhaps the most difficult step is abandoning destructive comparison. As long as you measure your life by the image of others, you become vulnerable to impulsive decisions. Machiavelli taught that envy is one of the greatest sources of strategic error. You don't need other people's lives, you need your own, built with intention. You don't need to break with everything tomorrow. The system is too big to be brought down by a single gesture. But you can move away from a passive position. You can transform every choice into a conscious act. You can replace haste with field reading, guilt with analysis, repetition with calculation. And hey-race, the final twist, money ceases to be the center of your life and becomes a consequence of your stance. When you learn to move within the system with composure, it stops dominating you emotionally. It doesn't become fair, but it becomes predictable. And what is predictable can be circumvented. You're not starting from scratch. You're starting from within. With a less hypnotized mind, a more attentive gaze, and a new willingness to not accept the first narrative offered to you. Machiavelli would say that true power lies not in controlling others, but in not being controlled by what you do not understand. Now, before you leave, I want you to do something simple, but symbolic. Like this video. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a milestone marking the moment you decided to see. Comment, even anonymously, on what impacted you the most or what you feel you need to change starting today. And subscribe to the channel, because here we will continue dismantling, step by step, the invisible systems that shape your life. This is not the end of the journey. It's the point where you stop going in circles and finally start choosing your own path.